This is $10,000. This is a lot of money. Now, if you were an average US American working 8 hours a day, it would take you about 2 months to make this much money. If you were a crook, you could go in and you could rob a bank, but you'd have to rob two banks to get this much money. And if you got caught, you'd have to do 20 years in prison. But thanks to the US government, you could get this $10,000 very easily if you were a fraudster this year. You could log into an online account, apply for an economic injury disaster loan, and they would deposit this money into your account within 2 days, even if you were not approved for the loan. They made it remarkably simple for fraudsters to get this money very quickly. Hello, and thank you for joining. My name is Frank McKenna, and I'm the Chief Fraud Strategist of AI firm Point Predictive. The title of my presentation is Devious Minds, the Battle for Corona Relief Funds. And what we're really talking about is stimulus fraud. It's the fraud of the year, if not the fraud of the century. Never before has so much money been stolen by so many people in so short of a time. It is definitely the fraud of the century, and I want to talk to you about what I found out this year and what happened. So what is stimulus fraud? It is not a fraud that you hear about each and every year. It only happens when there's a big tragedy in the world, unfortunately, like there was this year with the pandemic. Stimulus fraud is the intentional misrepresentation of facts to obtain business loans or government benefits that are intended for disaster victims. And it's the worst type of fraud because you're stealing money from those people that need it most. And it's the number one fraud type that happened here in the US and other parts of the country this year in 2020. Now, 2020 was really a fraudster's dream. It was a fraudster's dream for three reasons. And the first is that governments allocated trillions of dollars. Over $10 trillion was allocated by governments worldwide for people to take advantage of to stimulate the economies. And fraudsters love mountains of money. So they gravitated towards that trillions of dollars and tried to get as much as they could. Secondly, it was very easy money because the government needed to get that money into the hands of so many people that needed it. They had to relax fraud controls. So weak or non-existent fraud controls are a fraudster's dream. And finally, fraudsters love fast money. And that's exactly what the Corona Relief Funds provided. These funds needed to be dispersed within 60 days. Here in the US, the impact of stimulus fraud was enormous. The top three stimulus programs alone had close to $100 billion in fraud. The Paycheck Protection Loan Program, which was designed for small businesses that were suffering from the pandemic, had about $65 billion in fraud. The Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, which was for people that were unemployed, had about $25 billion in fraud. And the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program that was designed for struggling small businesses and farmers had about $2 billion in fraud. That's over $90 billion in fraud in the US alone from these programs. And it's not over. The US government is going to allocate another $2 trillion. So we're going to see even more fraud. And the US government is just starting to see how much of an impact this fraud is going to have. Hannibal Ware, the Inspector General for the Small Business Administration, the leader of the program that loaned these funds, said this is going to take years to unravel. The 41 criminal prosecutions that they identified for about $150 million are just the teeniest, tiniest, smallest tip of the iceberg, which means that this is going to take years to unravel. And if you believe him, and I certainly do, that says that hidden fraud from these stimulus program runs very deep. If you take those 41 cases that they've identified and prosecuted for paycheck protection fraud, and you look at what's under the surface, my estimate is that there's approximately 500,000 cases of fraud that remain to be investigated, detected, and prosecuted. That's enormous. The scale of fraud is off the charts with stimulus fraud this year. So let's break this down. Why did the US government and governments across the world become such targets for fraudsters? But more importantly, what can we learn from this? What can we take away as fraud fighters to make sure we don't end up in the same boat again? And the number one lesson that we all should learn from what happened with stimulus fraud this year is that fast money equals fast fraud. The faster you get the money out, the faster that the fraudsters are going to take advantage of it. And to really understand why this is, we only need to look at the SBA's Paycheck Protection Loan Program, which was designed for small businesses, and what happened there. The Small Business Administration in a typical year allocates about $28 billion for small businesses. But thanks to the pandemic, the US government allocated $650 billion for the SBA to loan to businesses that were struggling. That meant that the SBA had to disperse about 20 times their normal volume, but on top of that, they had to disperse those funds in 60 days. So that was a chaotic environment that the fraudsters took advantage of. They all rushed to get as much of that money as they could. And what do you do when you need to get money out fast? The first thing that an organization or a company does is relax their fraud controls. And that's exactly what happened in Washington State. And Washington State got burned very bad when they tried to get their money out quickly by relaxing fraud controls. This chart that you're looking at shows the unemployment fraud rate for Washington State from February of 2020 through July of 2020. And it shows you that back in February, before the pandemic, the fraud rate was running about 1.6%. In March, they decided to relax their fraud controls, relax their validations of fraud so that they could get the money out to unemployed victims very quickly. And what happened was that the fraud rate jumped to over 10%. And it continued to climb until early May, when they were under full-fledged attack, both domestically and internationally. The state of Washington had a 56% fraud rate on their unemployment claims in May. And it wasn't until they put the fraud controls back in and brought in the National Guard to become fraud analysts to get it back under control. Fast money equals fast fraud. And there's no better example of that than Washington State, as you can clearly see here. So what is the second lesson that we can learn? The second lesson is that certifications are a bad idea. Letting borrowers tell you that they told the truth on their applications as your primary fraud control is a horrible idea. It doesn't work, it's never worked, and it never will work. So if we look at the stimulus programs, in order to get the money out quickly, they had to remove fraud controls and allow on certifications. And these certifications were basically checkboxes that borrowers and people applying for unemployment would check off and say, yes, I am telling the truth on this application and I deserve these funds. But we know that fraudsters don't care about lying. In fact, so many people lied on applications that we lost billions of dollars. Certifications as a primary method of fraud do not work at all. And if you don't believe me, just look at Keith Morgan, the CEO of British Business Bank. Before the Bounce Back Loan Program, which is designed to serve small businesses in the UK, he warned the government that certifications would make the scheme vulnerable to abuse by individuals and participants of organized crime. And he was exactly right, because fast forward 4 months later, and of the $60 billion that was lent through the UK Bounce Back Loan Program, $26 billion of those loans will be lost. People set up fictitious businesses, they used identity theft, and they basically raided that program because the program relied primarily on certifications. That's the second lesson. Certifications simply don't work as a fraud control. And what's the third lesson? This is a very important lesson for us all. Fraud never makes sense. Fraud is an anomaly. It's a deviation from the norm, and it's always a pattern. So we as fraud professionals can find that pattern and stop it. But there were so many egregious patterns, so many anomalies on stimulus fraud that it became stupidly simple to find, but yet it wasn't because nobody was looking. So what was the primary method that fraudsters used to raid these stimulus programs? Well, they created Frankenstein applications. If they went out to apply for a loan or unemployment benefits, they used stolen identities that belonged to somebody else, often in another state. They created fake businesses that they said made millions of dollars, yet these businesses had no website address. These businesses had no presence on LinkedIn, You couldn't even Google these businesses and find information about them. They created fake addresses that they said these businesses were located at. Yet these businesses, if you looked at the address on Google, could have been empty lots, oftentimes trailer parks, or homes located in the middle of nowhere. They were definitely not business addresses. And they used synthetic identities to create employees that didn't exist. They created Frankenstein applications that defied every pattern of fraud that you could think of. And let's look at some of particularly egregious examples. So are there farmers in downtown Chicago? I asked this question, and the answer is obviously no. But if you looked at the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program between June and July of this year, it would appear in downtown Chicago that there would be thousands and thousands of farmers, but there was in fact none. But what we found in the data when it came through, there were 81,000 loans that were submitted in the downtown Chicago area, but there were only 19,000 businesses that existed in that area that would qualify. That meant that there were 61,000 fake companies that were set up to apply for these loans to take that money back. Most of those companies, or many of them, were agricultural companies, which we know wouldn't exist in that area. The second question, are 82% of people in Arizona unemployed? If you were to look at the unemployment numbers and look at the unemployment rates that came from Arizona, 2.8 million people in Arizona applied for unemployment, but there's only 3.4 million workers in the state. What happened is that there were millions of fraudulent claims through the unemployment office in Arizona that made it appear that everyone was unemployed. In fact, if you look at the numbers, 82% of the people, according to the stats, would be unemployed. It was fraudsters, and they were applying for loans and making it look like the numbers were really egregious. And what about in California? An investigative news agency looked at unemployment claims submitted in California between June and July of this year. And they found some astounding things. In fact, they found that 30,000 addresses were being used by fraud rings to raid the California unemployment benefits offices. In fact, this address located in Sacramento, California, had over 1,300 residents using different Social Security numbers, all applying for unemployment claims. Do these people live there? Of course not. But that home was empty. It was listed for sale, and fraudsters would go and pick up the envelopes with the checks, with the debit cards that were mailed to that address and take them because they knew nobody would be there. And are unemployed people living large? You would think so if you looked at the data from the California unemployment offices. This address is one of the most expensive homes in the world. It's a $78 million 8-bedroom mansion in Bel Air, California. Yet at this address, there were 479 claims with different people using different Social Security numbers, all to that address. These, of course, were fictitious claims. This house, again, was listed for sale, but it was used as a mail drop by these fraud rings. Or this mansion down the street, just mere blocks away from that Bel Air mansion, was another home listed that had 322 claims at the address. This home is worth $67 million. There's no way that there should be that many unemployment claims at that address. And if you recognize this address, you might, because it's the former home of Dan Bilzerian. This is the former king of Instagram. He left that home in July, and immediately when he left, fraudsters descended on it to use it as a mail drop for their sophisticated fraud schemes. So that's our lesson, that you need to look for fraud patterns. And the fourth lesson that we need to look at is you need to unite to fight fraud. You can't do it alone. Yet banks, lenders, companies, federal and state governments all tried to stop stimulus fraud alone, and it simply didn't work. If we need an example, let's look at unemployment fraud here in the US. In May of 2020, there was just one state reporting unemployment fraud attacks, and that was Washington State. By July, however, 35 separate states were being attacked by fraud rings. What had happened is the fraud rings, when Washington State cut them off, the fraudsters merely moved to another state because they knew that that state wasn't talking to Washington, and they probably had the same problems. And they were exactly right. So a wave of unemployment fraud swept over the country because nobody was collaborating on fraud. It could have been stopped right up front, but nobody was collaborating. So that's our fourth lesson, is collaboration is key to be able to stop fraud. And the fifth lesson that I want to tell you is that there is actually a secret weapon. There is a secret weapon that's often overlooked. There's a secret weapon that many people discount and they don't realize is probably the most important weapon against fraud. And that secret weapon is you. You are the secret weapon. You are the fraud fighter. Your company may have invested millions of dollars in tools, but it's you that bring it all together. You are the voice of fraud. Your company may want to launch a product that is prone to fraud, but you're the voice of fraud that tells them and warns them that that's a bad idea, and you tell them what to do. You are the protector from fraud. Your company, your organization may want to relax fraud controls, but you're the person standing in front of them telling them not to do that because you don't want to repeat the sins of the past. You've seen what happens. You protect the company from fraud. You protect your families. You protect victims from being victims of fraud and scams. You are the champion of fraud. When your company needs to invest in fraud, you're the one that stands up and makes sure that they do. You're the technologist. You're the person. You're the company. You're the fraud data scientist. You're the fraud analyst, the fraud manager that's coming up with new and innovative ways to counteract these fraudsters with new and better technology and better processes. And finally, you are the collaborator. You are the person that brings it all together. You join people to commonly fight against this fraud, to fight against the fraudsters together. And for that, I applaud you. You are the secret weapon. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon while I talk about the fraud of the century, stimulus fraud. I welcome you to connect with me via my LinkedIn profile, via my blog, which is called FraudCON Fraud. I write about 100 articles on fraud each and every year. I'd love for you to read it and connect with me. I'm a champion of fraud. I'm a champion of fraud data scientists, managers, fraud analysts. I just really want the industry to collaborate. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event.